Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, your RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We have a lot to talk about in this episode. We did a live stream pretty recently on Tuesday, so be sure to check that out. It's under the live section of our channel. That's the video on demand VOD. We're going to be covering the games that happened up until now. So, along with the draft lottery and more. So, we do have some. I think this is going to probably be a jam-packed episode. So we'll have about 3 games to cover. It should be fun because I think we both enjoyed the playoffs thus far. Before we get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at the OBT Podcast. And I guess to really kick this thing off, we should start with, the game 1 of the Lakers Nuggets series. We talked about this one on our live stream. So once again, be sure to check it out because, we did kind of go in deep on that game, and I thought that was some of our best content. To kick it off, once again, Nuggets Lakers, game 1, Nuggets took the game 132-126. For me, I picked the Lakers to win this series. I think you did as well. And I'm not necessarily worried with this one. A lot of people were like, since they didn't win game 1 like they had in all their other series, this means that they're going to lose a series. That's not true at all. They still have time for a split, and they still have time to just steal one at home in general. I guess, we got to start with the winners. We got to start with Jokic. He dropped 34 points, 14 assists, and 21 rebounds. I thought that was a phenomenal game from him. Then you have Aaron Gordon, 12 points. Not really, it was okay. Like, he had some emphatic, some big rebounds, some big dunks, but, you'd want to see more. Same from Porter Jr. He had 15 points, 10 rebounds. But you still want to see more from him as well. Jamal Murray, I thought, had a really good game. He had 31 points, 5 assists, 5 rebounds. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope was a big factor in this game. I think if he and Bruce Brown didn't play as well as they did, they probably would have lost this game. But, once again, KCP had 21, Bruce Brown 16. So overall, a pretty well-rounded game from the Nuggets. But it seemed like, the Lakers kind of just came into this game a little flat. In the first half, but they did have some really big adjustments in terms of guarding Jokic and limiting what he can do because, at one point it was a 21-point deficit that the Lakers were trying to conquer, and they made it a 6-point game. At one point it was down to 3. So, to their credit, I think the Lakers, they did have a valiant comeback effort, and, I think they've kind of figured out what makes Denver tick, and I think that's probably a huge factor going into, the next few games that are coming up, because if they can figure out Denver, then they are most likely going to take this series. I'm not going to say in a cakewalk, but it'll probably be easier than a lot of people thought. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the Lakers, but, just to go over their box score, 80 had 40 points, 10 rebounds, monster game. Just wasn't enough from, some of the other guys. AR had 23 points, 8 assists, 2 rebounds. He's been phenomenal. Definitely one of our X factors. I thought, he had a good game, but, he did struggle a little bit early, but later down the stretch, I thought he played fairly well. LeBron James, 26 points, 9 assists, 12 rebounds, so he's 1 assist short of a triple-double. I kind of would have wanted him to score around 30, but, you can only ask for so much, and, 26 is basically 30, so can't really complain on that, especially 40 minutes to have a triple-double damn near is pretty impressive to me. Looking down the list, you kind of just want more from D'Lo, honestly. He's one of our X factors as well for the Lakers. You want D'Lo to play better. Schroeder, I feel like you can live with Schroeder having 6 points, but D'Lo having 8, you want D'Lo around that 10. Honestly, 10 to 20, really 15 to 20 for me. I know some people feel differently. They probably say 10 to 15, but I'd want him, around 10 to 20 on efficient shooting and scoring. Then Hachimura, he had 17 points. I thought that was pretty quiet, but it was very helpful. Like that was underrated 17 points. And defensively, I thought he was a really big factor, especially on Jokic. And then Jared Vanderbilt had 0. Lonnie Walker had 6 points. So, I think this was just a case of, they didn't necessarily know what to do in the first half, but once they figured it out, you could kind of see the Nuggets were kind of trying to stop the bleeding, and it wasn't really working. But, just that first half lead, I thought was just a little bit too much for the Lakers to overcome. So, what were your thoughts on this game in general? Because I thought this was a very telling game, and I think this is most likely set the tone for the series. Like I said, the Lakers can probably win this series as they figured out Denver. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, like the thing is that like you said, like the Lakers don't necessarily have to win game one in order to win the series.
Right.
But like you said, I think Denver did a really good job coming out strong, setting the tone at home. Because the last couple of series we saw, the Lakers be able to steal game one on the road, right? And Denver, came out and made sure that didn't happen. Um, like you said, you start with Jokic, had a great game. For most of the game, right? It was a little bit more quiet in the fourth, but it I think some of that was also like he probably ran out of a little bit of gas, and he did a really good job, like you said, setting the tone, setting up all his teammates, and that's kind of the key for Denver because like for Denver, yeah, Jokic can have 30 points, right? But if everybody else doesn't come along for the ride, right, then it's going to be a lot harder to win. And pretty
Yeah.
much all the starters played well, at different points in the game, right? Like you said with Michael Porter Jr., he started off hot in the first half, kind of cooled off as the game went along.
Right.
Jamal Murray was really good pretty much throughout the game. Um, and just in general, like you just got a great play from the starting five, and Bruce Brown off the bench had an awesome game. Um, in the first half for the Lakers, like you said, they came out flat. In addition to that, I didn't like the lineup they started out with. I didn't like them starting off really small with three guards. Now, in fairness, right? Like, I mean, you could have a three guard lineup and it probably looked better than that, but also like the effort just was poor. But I just think
Hmm.
starting that starting lineup against a really big athletic Denver team, I just don't think is a good idea. And I think you're going to be really pressed to win games. Um, just like when you're starting off that small, because most of the damage Denver did was really in that first half because that's where the blowout came in, right? They
Yeah.
basically spotted Denver a 20-point lead early on. So kind of rough. Once they went with more size down the stretch, it got better, right? They started attacking the basket. They were able to get more stops. They started, rebounding better. And again, it was a pretty furious comeback, right? Because you don't, it's a lot harder to come back from big leads in the playoffs, just because usually the playoffs are a little bit slower paced.
Sure.
Obviously, Denver likes to play fast, but just in general, it was kind of wild how the Lakers had an opportunity to steal the game. Personally, I thought that they would have been pretty fortunate just because it takes a lot of energy to come back from a big lead.
Yeah.
Obviously you'd like to get the win in game 1, right? But, either way you have a chance to make up for it in game 2, make some adjustments, right, which they did do in the second half. They didn't have AD guard Jokic all the time, right? Like you mentioned, they had Rui Hachimura on him at different points, right? And kind of allowing AD to roam around like he could in the other series. Again, you can't put Rui on him the whole game, right?
Right.
Because obviously, he's 6'8", and even though he's really strong, right? Jokic at different points, he's smart enough that he can, kind of figure out what to do. Or Denver can, kind of make some other adjustments by, putting the guy that AD is guarding in more
Hmm.
actions. But either way, I do think the second half did kind of expose Denver's lack of rim protection because that's, obviously the Lakers did hit some threes. They hit 11 threes, but also LeBron and AD were getting to the basket at will,
Yeah.
right? Like, I mean, LeBron and AD combined only made 1 3, and it was actually Anthony Davis. So most of and they got 11 free throws each. So most of their work was around the basket. Um, and if you can get better defense, the rim will if you can get past the perimeter guys, the rim will always be there. You just got to avoid the turnovers. You got to avoid the bad shots. You got to play hard. And just not seed easy transition buckets. You mentioned D'Angelo Russell. He was kind of a big part of their struggles, right? He didn't have a great game on either end of the floor. And they, like when he doesn't play well, usually they'll bail on him and kind of go with Dennis. But ideally, for them to be at their best, he needs to play and play well. Like you can't get away with every single game. Him, being benched down the stretch. He only played
Yeah.
26. So, um, I don't know. I mean, like just in general, like I do feel like with D'Lo's playoff performances, like he's had some good games, right? Like, because I think he's got a reputation as a pretty consistently poor playoff performer. He's had some good games, some big games where they don't win without him. But you also kind of have to take some of the good with the bad. He's probably going to have like a couple of, bad games in a series where he
Sure.
can't play down the stretch. So for him, hopefully, like, he gets the game 1 jitters kind of out of the way and, kind of gets it going the rest of the series. It was kind of interesting how the coach for Denver, Michael Malone.
Mike
He
Malone. Yeah.
kind of mentioned, you know, um, like in an interview, right, where they were like, yeah, we were basically trying to take him out of the, game for the most part, and now it's like, will they play him or won't they play him? And I feel like I've never really heard a coach, say that about like a player that's not like one of the stars. Like usually you might hear them say like, yeah, we're trying to take LeBron or AD out of the game. But
Well,
you also but the second half of it, you don't usually hear where it's like, are they going to play him down the stretch or are they not going to? I don't know. That's just kind of like just kind of a weird situation. Again, I understand it. I feel like it's some of it's gamesmanship, maybe trying to kind of like, get into D'Angelo Russell's head. But it also was kind of just bizarre because I feel like I haven't heard that before.
I think
So I'm
there's
kind of
truth to
curious what
that.
your thoughts are. Yeah.
I think there's truth to that because I'm not trying to glaze D'Lo or anything, but he is one of my favorite players and one of my more liked players. But like
Right.
I think when he's prone when he gets hot, he's kind of hard to stop. That's the thing. So I feel like, there is some truth to that, but I wouldn't as a coach kind of expose myself like that and like just put that out there. But I really feel like a lot of this series does come down to D'Lo. And really not even just D'Lo, but all of the role player guys as a team, and that goes for both squads. Because if you look at it, the supporting casts aren't, insane. They're not like the greatest that we've ever seen. If you look at the Nuggets, Jamal Murray is a question mark. Michael Porter Jr. is still a question mark for me. Aaron Gordon's okay. Bruce Brown is really good, but KCP, that's a question mark. So it's like I don't know. The inconsistency is still there. Schroeder, same thing. Russell, Lonnie Walker, AR. Sometimes it's just weird. There's a lot of inconsistency going on. And I'm sure that probably is a mix of mind games and truth. But yeah, I feel like a lot of these games are probably going to be contingent on D'Lo having a more consistent and efficient game because if you look at like the score, they only lost by 6. So imagine if D'Lo, had like 16 or 20, so it's like it could be a completely different ball game, and who knows, Lakers win that one. So it's interesting
Yeah.
because I'm telling you, like
Yeah.
D'Lo takes a lot of pressure off of LeBron. People don't realize that because those sets
Yeah.
where D'Lo is, running the PNR with AD and it works, that can be the death of a lot of teams, and I don't think that's something that's talked about enough.
Their record when he plays well is really good. I mean,
Exactly.
I can't remember the exact record, but like they're pretty much like at least like a 60% win team whenever he plays well.
Right.
So like and again, that makes sense, right? He's one of their better players, so you need one of your better players to play well. If you want to win in the playoffs especially,
Yes.
right? It's one thing we're talking about regular season. And again, like we know he's going to have some good cuz again, like I think he's clearly good enough where he can win you a decent amount of regular season games, right? And
Hmm.
then in the playoffs, like it's a little bit of a mixed bag where it's like, people talk about like 82 game players versus like 16 game players, right?
Yeah.
Like we know, and we'll talk about it, in the next part, but we know Jimmy Butler is a 16 game player, right?
Right.
And obviously we're not comparing D'Angelo Russell to Jimmy Butler, but he's somewhere in between. Because I do feel like this playoff run for him has probably been better than we've seen in the past.
Hmm.
But also his role is different,
Yeah.
right? Because like say like in Minnesota, in Brooklyn, I think his first playoff performance, right? He was like the go-to guy, right? So obviously, like if he's like your best or second best player, right, then you're probably not that great of a team, and you're probably not going to get great performances out of him,
Right.
right? But on a team like this, where they're at their best when he plays well, but they're not necessarily reliant upon him. That's kind of like a semi perfect role for him, just in general, because again, it allows you, to take advantage of his biggest strengths. Like you said, like, cause you know his game. You're a huge fan of his
Oh
game,
yeah.
right? So, like he's a very good ball handler,
Yep.
pretty solid in the pick and roll.
Yep.
When he gets it going, he can, he's a pretty good shooter.
Hmm.
So just in general, I mean, like there's a lot of positives about his game, but again, at the same time, like, you got to be better than that. Because again, we
Yeah.
know we're not going to get great defense, but, you got to give at least some effort. And then on offense, you just got to take some smarter shots. Like a few of his shots that he took were like these post up shots on guards that aren't really any smaller than him. In fact,
Yeah.
they're kind of big, or in some cases bigger than him, right? Jamal Murray's about the same size as him. I
Hmm.
think probably a little bit bigger, right? More
Yeah.
athletic for sure.
Hmm.
Um, then when you look at say KCP, right, he's about the same size, right?
Yeah.
He's just more athletic. So this is a series where I think like it's gonna be difficult kind of for him just because you got bigger, more athletic physical guards.
Sure.
But just in general, like if you get good games out of him, like you said, I think that definitely raises the ceiling. We do know that.
Yeah.
Um, but just in general, like And again, it wasn't like he was the only guy that didn't
No,
play well,
but
right?
you
Like
have to
Vanderbilt
signal it
wasn't
out when when his poor performance clearly impacts the team. We have to talk about it, but we're not trying to
yeah,
single him
exactly.
out or anything like that.
Right. Like there were other guys that also didn't play well. Like Vanderbilt didn't really give them that great of a performance. I thought Schroeder was okay, right? But again, like just in general, like I just don't like the idea of going super small against this team, particularly against the starters. Again, I understand it to a semi extent if we're talking about when they go to their bench, like when Jokic is off the floor,
Sure,
but definitely not the starting five. So that's something that I think that they're gonna change over the course of the series, right? Like
sure,
we're not gonna see that starting lineup again. I don't think. I would be shocked if we did. I mean,
yeah,
like because it didn't work.
yeah,
So, but just in general, yeah, again, we know that either team could win this series, right? Because we both picked the Lakers to win, but we also know that Denver can win this series. They do have home court, right? They have a superstar with a solid supporting cast. So they pretty much have what they need in order to win this series. It's just, it's kind of like what you said. I think that they need to win most of their, well, not most. I think they need to win pretty much all of their home games. I mean,
right,
because they're not as good on the road. Obviously, they had that big road win against Phoenix, but this Lakers team at home is also undefeated.
yeah,
So just in general, like I just feel like you said, I kind of agree with you. Where if Denver loses, at one home game, I'm not going to say the series is over, obviously, because it's never over after one game. But the series definitely tilts back in favor to the Lakers if they
yeah,
can win at home,
yeah,
or
yeah,
if they can win in Denver, because Denver's a tough place to play. I
very
mean,
altitude.
Denver is one of the best home teams in the league, right? That's one of the reasons why they're the number one seed. You got the high altitude, that's a factor, right? Their role players typically play better at home, which is, the case for most teams, right? But because Denver is not super deep, right? Like it's kind of important for their role guys to play well, because, again, like you're probably not going to get every member of the starting five to play well every game. If you do, you're going to win. But
Yeah,
it should be a really good series, I think.
yeah, I think so too. And the highs are high and the lows are low for this Lakers team. I feel like, and that's kind of the narrative that you guys have had for this season.
So obviously now we're going to get into LA Denver game 2. Denver wins 108-103 to go up 2-0 in the series, protect home court. The star of this game for Denver was Jamal Murray. It was kind of interesting. LA defensively did a much better job on Jokic, but Jamal Murray had a huge fourth quarter. Um, Started off slow for most of the game, right? And then just had a huge fourth quarter, getting to the line, 9 of 10 from the line, 6 of 14 from three to finish the game, 37 points.
Yeah,
10 rebounds, 5 assists. Jokic, 23 points, 17 boards, 12 assists, 9 of 21. So not as efficient, not as good of a night, but still a positive. Michael Porter Jr. hit some big shots in the fourth quarter, 16, 7, and 3. Aaron Gordon, 10 points, 4 rebounds, a block. Um, Caldwell Pope, more of a quiet night, but again, you got a bigger Jamal Murray night, and you still got, some decent production out of some of the other role players like Bruce Brown. Jamal Murray's not a role player, right? But you got a huge game
yeah,
out of him. Michael Porter Jr. Right? To me, this game was really interesting in the sense of like, obviously, if you're Denver, you feel great about it because this was, but if you're LA, this was to me kind of a blown opportunity because this was a low scoring or at least lower scoring, ugly game. LA was in control for most of the game. But then they had a lot of stretches where like their offense just couldn't get going at all. The execution was awful. Um, and some of that was due to the Denver defense, but some of it was just bad shot selection. I mean, um, when you look at LA, like I think this game is kind of on the stars for the most part. LeBron was 9 of 19, 0 of 6 from three. Some of that was like a little bit inflated because I think he had a couple of buckets like when the game was basically
yeah,
over.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and then AD 18 points, 14 rebounds, 4 blocks, but 4 of 15. The shot selection, a lot of threes from both of those guys. They took 9 threes combined. I just don't think those are the shots you want.
Right.
Um, 3-point shooting overall as a team, other than Austin Reeves, was pretty bad. They made 8 threes. He made 5 of them. And a couple of them, like I think he had like a banked in three. Like so, I mean, it was like a
It was
like
late. Yeah,
yeah. D'Lo 1 of 5 from three, minus 16. I just don't know necessarily what you can do about it because like It's not quite as bad as game 1, but, like, again, -16 in a game you lost by 5. He didn't close at all. They have Dennis Schroeder out there. He plays 30 minutes, so almost the same, and he wasn't necessarily great either. He was okay defensively, but again, like, this is kind of what we talked about in game 1 where, like, it is on the stars, but, like, also, like, some of the process is kinda tough because it's like this is why, again, when D'Lo plays well, the Lakers are better because when he's not playing well and he's sitting on the bench and you got Shooter out there, the Lakers are just a lot easier to guard. And it just like their offense for most of the game was just brutal. Because again, I just mentioned, right? 9 threes from their two best players who aren't great 3-point shooters, and a lot of those were in the fourth. I think AD took I think pretty much all of his threes, I think, in the fourth, right? It
Right.
was at least two.
Yeah.
LeBron, I think, took
3
three.
maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, a strange game from him too, because even though he was 9 of 19, he had like in the first half, he had like I think two transition possessions where he was like it was a breakaway and he just lost the ball. And again, you lose by 5, that's 4 points, and they turn into like turnovers. So I mean like that's just brutal. Like those type of blown opportunities you just can't have in a playoff game. I mean,
And they were
Rui,
flopping all over the place too. So I
yeah,
don't know what the hell is going on.
Yeah, I mean, like, just a weird game, just in general from the stars. Rui was great off the bench. Personally, I didn't like the starting lineup. I didn't like the insertion of Vanderbilt. I know he started earlier in the playoffs, but I just don't like it. I think he really messes up their offense. Um, because they had like he got a couple of stops early on, but that was like within the first two possessions, right? And then after that, they were playing off of him, and LA just couldn't score. And like again, that was kind of the theme of a lot of several stretches of the game. And again, like I guess they were better defensively to start the game, but at what cost? I mean, like the offense didn't work, and it just looked like some of those guys were just kind of gassed
Yeah.
um, at the end. Because again, I think there was a play where LeBron he comes in and steals the inbound pass, gets a breakaway, and again another layup just smoked
Yep.
basically.
He missed a
Um,
wide open dunk. So
yeah, I mean,
it's
like just
rough.
in general, like it's just not a good enough performance from your stars. And again, that's a missed opportunity because in the playoffs you can't. And I'm not saying they gave away the game because you give credit to Denver, for hanging around. The turning point to me was when Denver was able to extend the lead when
Yeah.
Jokic was out of the game because they took him out. Um, what was it like 9.5 minutes in the fourth, I think, and he
Hmm.
was out for like what, like a minute or so, and
Yeah.
I think they were down. They were either down or they were tied when he came out. And they were able to get it to a 4-point lead. And to me, that was kind of the game. I know LA, got it, close again, but
Right.
I'm just like, if you lose the Jokic minutes, you're not winning because that happened in game 1 as well, where Jokic was out of the game and they lost, those minutes. Um, and at this point, you kind of just have to hope, like, if that you're at that, home, that you're at home, and I guess you get better performances from some of these other guys because, like, it's a lot of pressure now because this game was a winnable game even more so than the first one, because they were up for most of the game.
Yeah.
Um, and just I don't want to say gave it away because again, like, you give credit to the winning team, but like you just can't lose a game like that in the playoffs. Like, because if you lose, let's say they lose like a game 7 in Denver or something, or whatever, right? Like, regardless, like it's kind of like what we talked about, if Boston had lost to Philly in the second round, where it's like, those type of games you just cannot lose. And it's kind of odd how LeBron and AD for most of the game were offensively really awful, but like they were still up for most of the game because you had a great Reeves game, a great Rui game, um, just enough where like in the fourth quarter you needed one of your two stars to take you home, and unfortunately they just weren't able to do it. And I know fatigue, like I said, played a factor because they were doing a lot defensively. Because in this game, we talked about in game 1 how they had Rui on Jokic, they had LeBron on Jokic a lot too, and he was kind of like the main guy for long stretches guarding Jokic. Um, and, that's I guess kind of the price you pay where like, if you do that, then that's where the fatigue comes in. And that's kind of where not having, a capable big man to kind of just put out there for a little bit, that's where it hurts, right? Because, not being able to put out Wenyan Gabriel, because I think he's a little too small,
Yeah.
or not being able to put Mo Bamba because he's hurt out there. That's kind of where it hurts you because, by the time it's the fourth quarter and those guys have to get a lot done on offense, they just have no legs. I mean, like,
Yeah, that's a good point.
Nothing. Yeah, I mean, like that's and that again, this was the game that you needed to win because you lost game one. It's gonna be really tough, at this point to win the series again, like because Denver, they're great at home. They closed it out, and Jamal Murray hit some big time shots. It's really tough now. Like, I mean, again, like our picks, we both picked LA to win the series. It's definitely in jeopardy now. With the way they lost game two, so you kind of have to hope that you just get better performances at home because again, there's a lot of pressure now. Because if you lose even one game at home, like then that's kind of the series right there. And if you lose, you look back at this game, and this is kind of the game where if you lose the series, like you know, you're gonna be kicking yourself. When they watch the film of this game, because I mean, primarily on offense, because the defense was good enough to get it done.
Yeah.
Because even on some of the shots Jamal Murray hit, they were well guarded, but like the offense is what did them in, and that was kind of one of the concerns going against Denver was if you're LA, you have to have better offensive performances than they had up to that point because Denver's a better offensive team. And like I said, this was the game to win, and that's a really brutal loss. That's a tough one. And again, like we talked about, like LeBron and AD didn't play very well, right? D'Angelo Russell, that's another not so great game. And I just kind of wonder where they go with him because I know some people have talked about like maybe he comes off the bench. I know reportedly I think Dave McMenamin mentioned that I think that if they were to have him come off the bench, they might lose him. I don't know if it'll get to that point, but it does feel like this might just be a really rough series for him because Denver's guards are big and athletic and physical. And 3 for 8 isn't bad, right? But 1 of 5 on threes, and some of them were tough threes, just kind of rough. But like I said, for me, the stars to me are the main guys, like that kind of cost you the game because they just weren't good enough to close it out. But at the same time, again, what they had to do on defense, like that's kind of the price that you pay. Where like if you're gonna play that high level of defense, you got no legs. And again, like even execution on offense, they weren't really attacking Jamal Murray. A lot of settling. Just overall, just a poor performance by, again, the players, the coaching staff. But if you're Denver, obviously you got to feel pretty, relieved that you had, in game one, you were up for most of the game, almost blew it, but still pulled it out. And then in this game, the other team was up for most of the game, and then they blow it and you pull it out. You got to feel really good if you're Denver because it does kind of feel like one factor in the fourth quarter for sure for Denver is it feels like they can get whatever shot they want. And that definitely you definitely don't feel like that with LA, but it's weird because they were in the first half getting to the rim, punishing Denver at the rim, but every time they would make a mistake, Denver would just run out. And like again, that's the price you pay when you play at that type of pace where you're gonna be gassed. And just in general, this is what makes Denver a tough team and especially at home, because when you have to play at that pace and at that level of intensity for 48 minutes with the altitude and with the way Denver plays, it's tough. And that's what makes it a tough matchup for anybody. Even forget the Lakers, whoever comes out of the East, right? Like, let's say Denver makes it to the finals, that's tough. Now, Denver doesn't have home court against Boston, but either way, right? Like, they've been showing why Denver's a tough place to play. They're still undefeated at home, right? So they've won, what is it, like 9 or 10
Yeah.
games at
Yeah.
Ball Arena. So I mean, just overall, just a really big fourth quarter show out by Denver, especially Jamal Murray, right? Pretty much carrying them on the offensive end, and it just feels like a missed opportunity by the Lakers. It was rough. It was about as bad as it gets. To me, that was probably about as bad as their two stars have played in a playoff game. Um, Primarily on the offensive end. I think
Yeah, for sure.
defensively it seemed fine because again, like just in general, right? Like when you have to guard those guys, like Jokic for most of the game, it's gonna cook you and it's gonna fry you, but you still got to find a way to play through fatigue. And we've seen these guys do it before, but it just wasn't enough to win this game. And it definitely feels like a blown opportunity if you're LA.
Yeah. And for me, I look at this as, you can't have Rui be your leading scorer through three three quarters, I think, and pretty much, up until pretty much the end of the fourth. I think that's, I'm not saying like that's the reason that they lost, but their stars need to, play at the tier that they've been playing, more recently. Um, and then have those Rui games and those Reeves games to accompany, your stars games, because they probably would have won this game if AD and LeBron, did play extremely well, and same with D'Lo. But
Average, an average performance probably could have,
exactly,
could have gotten them a win.
yeah, it was just ugly from
A
the jump.
combined 14 for 34, I think, right? So
Yeah,
I mean, that's or 13 for 34. I mean, like that's pretty rough. And just I mean, in general, I mean, like I think math wise, that's about 40%.
yeah,
Um, and that's just not good enough. Especially again, if Denver stars, and again, it wasn't like Jokic was amazing, but he was still pretty good. I mean,
yeah,
Jamal Murray was awesome. So it's like, especially if the other two stars, pretty much outplayed you for most of the game, like that can't happen if you're gonna win these type of games where it's close. Because it's one thing if it's a blowout and like everybody on the team is contributing, so there's not like one guy that has like a big share of the offense.
right,
But again, in this game, you didn't really get a whole lot out of a lot of different guys because again, like it was pretty much four guys for most of the game on offense, right? It was Rui, Reeves, and again, like those were the guys that were doing it for most of the first half.
yeah,
So, I mean, like, like just in general, I mean, like that's just not a good enough performance. And again, like it's a collective effort as a team, but those guys got to play better. And it's just like it just felt like it was too much settling. Because again, I talked about it right, like earlier with all the jumpers, too many threes for guys that aren't great 3-point shooters. And to AD's credit, he did make one, but I didn't think he was gonna make two. And
yeah,
it was just also just strange execution. Because I think the second three that missed, or I guess his third attempt, but the one that missed, right? It was a weird play where I think Schroeder had a lane to the basket, probably could have just taken it up because again, it's not like Denver has elite rim protection, but instead kicks it out to AD, who's spaced in the corner, for a three, and it's again, if that's like Reeves or I guess D'Lo wasn't hitting this game, but again, like if it's one of those other guys, that's okay.
yeah,
That's not a terrible play, right? But again, if it's AD who just hasn't been a great 3-point shooter, and well, he's never been a great 3-point shooter, but the last two seasons he's been a bad 3-point shooter.
yeah,
So you don't want him taking that type of shot late in the game. But it is kind of wild because like a few years ago, right, he had the game against Denver where they set up the game-winning 3-pointer by him, but for most of his career, he's never really been a good 3-point
he
shooter.
can
So I
hit
just
it, but it's not
yeah,
great.
I just don't like those type of shots late in the game, and it's brutal because again, like the offense is what killed you because you just too many long stretches where they just couldn't score. I mean,
Yeah,
in the third quarter, I mean, well, no, not even in the third quarter. I mean, like for most of the quarters, they never scratched more than 30. I mean, I guess Denver didn't either, right? But their offense completely took a nosedive as the game continued to go. I think they had 27 in the first, 26 in the second and the third, and then 24 in the fourth. And that's the difference.
yeah,
Because if you just got close to matching your normal totals, you probably win this game. Again, like, just that's tough to bounce back from. I mean, again, those guys have been through a lot. So, again, I suppose you can trust them for sure more than say like a Harden or Embiid, but this is the toughest position they've been in this postseason. Because this is I think it's pretty clear this is definitely the best team they faced. And they hadn't trailed in a series up to this point. But it's pretty much do or die now because you have to win both games in LA.
yep,
Um, which is I guess is possible because Denver's not a good road team. But again, all it takes is like one decent Denver game on the road, and that's pretty much it. So
and
like
that's
this
why
is
I was saying, it was crucial for LA to take one, and now that they don't have the split, I think Denver's probably going to win this in either 6 or 7, honestly.
yeah, because it's just because again, like you have to win at least one in Denver.
Yeah,
So it's like if you don't win, and these were your two best chances to win because it's early in the series when everybody's got fresher legs. Over the course of a series, guys are going to get fatigued. And the way Denver plays, like, I mean, they were tired at the end of the game, but LA got tired, faster. So, the longer the series goes, the better case scenario it is for Denver because as the series goes on, it's just going to be more and more fatigue.
yeah,
Um,
and I know
for
LeBron. I know he tweaked his ankle. It looked
yeah,
like maybe, so I don't know. If he,
he tweaked it a couple of times in the game, and we
yeah,
already know, going into the playoffs that was kind of a thing to look out for was his foot. So like in general, it's just rough, because again, you had to kind of win one of these first two games. I suppose mathematically, obviously, it's not over, but yeah, it definitely feels more like Denver's gonna win the series because you have to, ideally, you got to win one of the first two games in Denver. So it's definitely tough. It looks tough for our picks. Again, I suppose mathematically it's not over yet, but so far, Denver's got them in, I guess, check is what you would probably call it, right?
Yeah.
Not quite checkmate, right? 3-0, 3-1 is definitely checkmate.
LA's backs are against the wall right now.
Yeah,
They're on
for
the
sure.
ropes.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it's like, who else are you going to trust, right? Because do you, do you trust a guy, say like a D'Angelo Russell, to show up as the series gets,
At
really
home, probably, but not
at
away.
home? At home, you would think so, because he's generally been much better at home. But again, that's kind of a key X factor, right? Because again, Denver's guards, for the most part, I guess, have outplayed LA's guards. Outside of I guess Reeves has been really good.
Yeah,
But both
but still,
D'Lo, yeah, both D'Lo and Schroeder have really struggled in this series. Um, Whereas Jamal Murray's I've easily been the best guard for any for either team. KCP not as good of a night tonight, right? But obviously you'll take the game one he has, and in general you don't expect 20 a night from him anyways.
no.
And then Bruce Brown has also been really good. So that's kind of the tough part to be in because what helped LA for a good chunk of the playoffs was the strong play of their guards. But when you only got really one of them playing well, and your two best players didn't really play good enough either, that's a recipe for a loss. And
Yeah,
again, it's brutal because they were up for most of the game until the fourth quarter. So that makes it a really tough series for LA now. Like you said, their backs are definitely against the wall. Um,
yeah,
as the series continues to go on. Because again, like it's gonna be tougher because you're gonna get more tired. There's gonna be a lot more pressure. Um, and I think the Stars can handle the pressure, but just in general, right? Like that's a tough ask, because now you got to win four of the next five.
yeah,
Um, and that's a really that's a really tough position to be in.
yeah, for sure. I agree 100%. And to keep it on moving, or keep it moving, we've got to talk about the Heat Celtics series. This is a matchup that I wanted to see earlier in the playoffs, but here we are once again. And Miami came out and took game one.
This is honestly maybe better because now it's again like last
Exactly.
year, a trip to the finals is on the line as opposed to just a first round matchup.
The stakes are higher. And I like Miami. I like Miami more than Boston. Like as a team to root for, but I did pick Boston to win this series. And now they're down 0-1. Miami did take the win in this game, 123-116. I believe we both have Miami beating, or we both have the Celtics beating Miami, in the
Yeah.
7-game series. But we do have to start with the winners. Jimmy Butler had a phenomenal performance, 35 points, 7 assists, 5 rebounds, and some huge clutch buckets. Kevin Love, 8 points, 6 rebounds, and, he was scoring at the right time, which is funny. And I feel like that's kind of the case for, everybody besides Jimmy and Bam. Bam had 20 points, 8 rebounds, 5 assists. That's a great game. Gabe Vincent, Max Strus, Caleb Martin, Kyle Lowry, they put on some big numbers, I think, personally. They each had 15 points. And that's something that I feel like the Heat have been missing is overall bench scoring and overall role player play. They've been a little streaky. Not to say, they're bad or anything. I think they're great, especially for a lot of them are undrafted, or a couple of them are undrafted guys. So, Gabe Vincent, I think it's Struss as well, or Struce. And then Kyle Lowry, he did have 15 as well. So, all of these guys did perform very well, I thought. And they performed well at the right time. Like, that's the thing. Because I believe going into the half, I think Boston was up by 10, I think. And then, in the third quarter, Miami just came out and just kind of overtook Boston, overwhelmed them, and completely adjusted and switched up the game plan. So, props to Miami for coming out and stealing game one. That's a huge look for them. I think they're the big underdogs in this. And, like I said, they're my dark horse, but I do believe in them. But I also have more faith in Boston just due to the roster and the star power that Boston has. But we do have to talk about Boston. I think they're the ones that we kind of have to talk about more so because they did lose this game when they shouldn't have, in my opinion. But, just to look at the box score, then we'll get into what happened in the game. Boston, Jason Tatum had 30 points, 7 rebounds. Al Horford, 7 points, 2 assists, 6 rebounds. Not a fan of, his performance on the glass, really. I think, Al Horford should be a little bit more aggressive on the rebounding aspect of the game, but it is what it is. Um, and then, Robert Williams had 14 points, 7 rebounds. Jaylen Brown, 22 points, 5 assists, 9 rebounds. Marcus Smart, he had a really good first half, but I don't know what happened. But he had 13 points, 11 assists, 1 rebound. It's kind of ugly in my opinion. I mean, like I like the assists and the, spreading the ball around, but just some of the shots I'm just not a fan of. Uh, Malcolm Brogdon, 19 points, 1 assist, 2 rebounds. Derek White, 11 points, 2 rebounds. And then I don't even want to talk about Peyton Pritchard because this is the problem I have with Boston. Um, I feel like one of the reasons why they lost this game is coaching. Joe Mazzulla didn't really look like he knew what he was doing in this game, in my opinion. I think he got a little too deep by putting in Pritchard. If you're going to get deep like that, I feel like Grant Williams is a better option. But I don't know. The Peyton Pritchard minutes were kind of ticking me off because why is he out there? Not to disrespect him or anything, but, he shouldn't be out there in situations where you're fighting for your life in this game. I feel like Jason Tatum should have the ball in his hands and he should be, doing his magical thing. But that's not what they did. And it was just so weird. The adjustments were very off. Boston had some huge mental turnovers and just mental lapses that kind of just threw me for a loop. I was like, what? This doesn't even look like the same team that was playing Philly. And they didn't even look that great against Philly. So, and this is this was one of my concerns with them coming into this playoffs, this year's playoffs in general. They just didn't look like the regular season team that we saw. They didn't look like they had, that fire lit underneath it. It's just so weird. I don't know. But like I said, I think, this is one of those teams where they can potentially get complacent and let teams walk all over them for a second. Then they get slapped in the face with a huge wake-up call. Then they end up winning the series in late games, like game 6 or 7, when it didn't need to be that way. They could easily win this in 5 really, but now it's probably going to go to probably 6 or 7. And, that's not a knock on Miami because Miami's a great team in terms of the guys that they have, the experience they have, the coaching. But I just feel like talent-wise, talent sometimes does beat experience, but also vice versa. Experience does beat talent sometimes as well. But, what were your thoughts on this one? Because I was very disappointed in Boston. But, I have to give credit to Miami as well because they are my dark horse.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting, the way that Boston, started off in the first half. They were playing, really well. Jason Tatum, right, did most of his damage. I think he had 18 at halftime, right? So a great first half from him.
Yeah.
Like you said, Marcus Smart with his passing, he did a really good job, kind of getting everybody into their spots, and setting everybody up for the, offensively in the first half, right? I think he had most of his assists in the first half,
Exactly.
literally. Robert Williams did a great job early getting on the offensive glass, right? Doing his thing, lob threat. We've talked about this a lot of times for Boston, right? Um, but then in the second half, right, like it just wasn't working. I mean, like it was kind of interesting because one of the things that we talked about, I think, on our live stream, was we talked about like Miami's offense, right? And we mentioned how in that series against the Knicks, right, their offense was pretty awful. Whereas in that Buck series, right, they did a great job,
Right.
knocking down timely shots, right? I think they were the best offense in the first round, or if not, they were pretty close. And because they were so awful on offense, right? Like in that first, half, or not first half, in that series against the Knicks, you were kind of wondering, like, okay, at some point they're going to have a regression to the mean. And this was kind of one of those games, right? And again, like you said, not to take anything away from Miami, but they
Right.
did have a really hot night in terms of, shot making. I mean, they shot over 50% from three, 54 from the field.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Jimmy Butler, 2 of 4 from three, right? Including the crazy one, right? That, spins around and in, right? It was that kind of night.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, Kevin Love hitting big threes, Gabe Vincent, Max Strus. And again, like some of these were not easy threes, right? Like
No.
some of these were, like Max Strus had a few where he was, off the dribble, pull up threes. Like just, I mean, the shot making from Miami was terrific in the, especially in that second half. So, again, it'll be interesting to see if they can keep this up, right? But either way, like even if they lose game 2, you did what you needed to do. You got the split. But just in general, right? Like that's kind of one of the interesting aspects about Miami is they're a really smart team. They're a tough team. And one issue with Boston is like in addition to the coaching, just in general, like the overall play of the players, a lot of times in these big moments, like it just seems like the quality and the level of play just drops off. And it's kind of like you said, kind of disappointing and bizarre to see if you're, pulling for Boston just because like they have a lot of talent. You know that on any given night, right, they have a number of guys that can, you know, play really well on both ends of the floor.
Right.
But, like, Jason Tatum, like, I think he had what, 0 points, pretty much shot out or shut out in the 4th quarter. Did he even
Mhm.
get a shot attempt off?
That's what I'm saying. I don't know. I think he got maybe one, but
Yeah.
it's still like
Yeah.
that's my problem. Like Tatum should have the ball in his hands and they should be running the offense through him. I love Jalen Brown, but Tatum is better in my opinion. There's been times where, it's been back and forth where you don't know who's the number one guy. But I think this season, thus far, and in these playoffs, I think Tatum has proven that he should have the ball in his hands more frequently. But, it is what it is. It's one game. That's why I'm not worried. But I am
Right.
frustrated with the fact that um, Boston just came out and did that, and I have to put that
Yeah.
on the coach because there's no other explanation I can really, find. I've been searching for one, but
And,
can't really
like
find
we said, some of the similar issues that we've had, with Boston at times, right? Like Marcus Smart, right? Like, you know, even though he's a good decision maker at times,
it. Hmm.
with the ball in his hands in the second half, right? He kind of went away from that and got a
Yeah,
little too shot happy.
exactly.
Um, and again, like, 3 of 7 from the floor, right? That's fine. Um, and just like 2 of 4 from 3, that'll work. But just in general, right? Like, I mean, I don't know. Like, and again, this has been a problem with Boston all year where they've just seemingly had these games where they just kind of implode. I mean, and it's happened in the playoffs, right? Like, that 7 game series against Philly should not have been 7 games, right? Again, you give credit to Philly for extending it, but a couple of those losses were kind of self-inflicted, right?
Right.
Especially the game one loss. And that's just the problem with this team. And like, again, there's a point when it's kind of just you are who you are, right? Like we talked about it with the Warriors, where they were a bad road team for pretty much the whole season,
Yeah.
right? And then even though they had the 2 road wins against the Kings, right, in the playoffs, right, they were still bad on the road, right?
Right.
I think they were 2-5 on the road in the playoffs, right, which isn't really much better than their road record percentage over the course of the regular season. So
Right.
just in general, that's kind of something, unfortunately, that you're probably just going to have to put up with the Celtics. It's just you kind of hope that in game 2 you respond with just better execution. Hope if you would think Miami would probably cool down, on the offensive end,
Hmm.
right? Because again, if you're going to have performances like that every single game, I mean, they're going to win the series if they shoot 50% from three every game. But
Right.
and again, I also want to give credit to Jimmy Butler. He did a good job
Sure.
in the second half guarding Tatum. And that was kind of something that concerned me about Miami is how are you going to be able to, slow down Tatum and Brown because you really only have Butler pretty much for the most part who can guard those guys one on one, right? Like Love, he's not going to be able to guard Jalen or Jason, right? Same with Vincent, same with Struess. Um, but again, like, it's just you got to give credit to Miami's execution because they definitely do have a coaching advantage. And again, it's not all on the coach because I mean, like, just Tatum, he had a couple of plays late in the game, right, where he had back to back travels, I think, right? Like to
Yeah,
me,
that was
like that's
ugly. That was
yeah,
ugly.
like that's like that to me is more of like a mental mistake. And maybe you can make the case of like, well, he didn't really get any shot attempts, so maybe he was just kind of off rhythm, and that kind of is what led to the travels. But like just mistakes like that, like we've seen Boston do that a lot.
The Robert
And again,
Williams turnover where he literally
yeah,
like caught the rebound and then just threw it back to Miami and it's like WTF.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Like, and again, like that kind of stuff. I mean, it's a 7 game series, first to four. So
Mhm.
it's not the end of the world, but it is something to keep in mind, because I think most people after Milwaukee, got eliminated, looked at Boston as the favorites. And it's like, you know, those type of mistakes, maybe it doesn't cost you against Miami, but I'm pretty sure it will cost you against, whoever comes out of the Western Conference. Because,
Right.
just like Miami, who's a very smart, a team with a lot of experience, right? Denver, LA, right? Those are 2 highly intelligent teams, right? That are going to take advantage of mistakes that you make. So I mean, just in general, I mean, you just you got to be better if you're Boston. And again, like you said, credit to Miami because they won. They hit a lot of tough shots over the course of the game, right? Bam, this is a big series for him, right? Because you can see defensively, right, where they're kind of just, backing off in the paint and, kind of giving him, those mid-range, floaters or, just the jumpers, the short-range jumpers. And, he has to take those. He's got to make those. He's got to be aggressive. Because again, like in terms of their offense, right, one of their he's their second best player pretty much. So I mean, they need him to have big games in order to win, right?
Yeah.
If if Bam has nights like he had in game 1, somewhere around that range, right, where you're getting somewhere around 20 a game, somewhere around 10 rebounds, somewhere around, 5 assists, right? Like just a general solid good, really good Bam game, right? Obviously that raises the ceiling for Miami, right? Because if Bam outplays Boston's bigs by a considerable amount, right, and then Butler is the best player on the floor, that's going to be a pathway for Miami to win.
Yeah. Um, and then, I don't know. This is very interesting. I think this is going to be a long series now. At first I mean, I think, we did kind of agree that it was going to be 6 or 7, so I can't really say now, but, I think this is still going to be a long series. It's going to be a fight. Jimmy Butler's not going down without a fight. I can tell you that for sure.
No.
They're not going to go quietly. They're going to go kicking and screaming. And that's what I think is going to happen. I think the Celtics are still going to bounce the Heat. And like I said, I think this is the Celtics' year, so I have them going to the finals now. I don't know if you agree with that or not. I think it's probably too soon for you, but I'm willing to jump the gun here and say that they're probably going to win the title. Um, and I guess really to move on, we've got to talk about the draft lottery. This happened on Tuesday as well, so go check out the live stream if you want some more of our thoughts on this. And I guess to go over the order. San Antonio, they won the Wembanyama sweepstakes, so that race is officially over. So San Antonio Spurs, they have the number 1 pick. Um, this is a big deal for them. Victor Wembanyama is one of the most, I guess you could consider him one of the best NBA draft prospects ever. Since LeBron. That's the narrative. He's 7'5", 8-foot wingspan. Everybody knows who Wemby is. He's breaking the internet. He's only 19 years old. And I think he was in the French league, I think it was. And, he was leading the league in scoring, rebounds, blocks. He's just a monster. He's one of a kind. He's a unicorn. Franchise changer for sure. So the Spurs have the number 1 pick, but I feel like that's not even the biggest story here. We've got to look at, some of the other, where the other teams fell in the lottery. So, number 2 pick went to Charlotte, which I think is a good thing for them, but we'll see what they do with it. And I guess, for the number 2 pick, I feel like if Wemby wasn't here, Scoot would probably be number 1, honestly, because I'm not going to say just as good of a prospect, but, he is a generational talent, but there are tiers to that. And I think Scoot is in a high tier, but not as high as Wemby. But, Scoot does bring a lot, his frame, athletic speed, and he's only 6'2", but he's super fast, dribble, can ball handle like crazy, insane quick first step. But, he should be a great finisher. And I've seen a lot of people comparing the two players. I don't want to make this just about them, but I'll be quick about it. A lot of people are starting to doubt Wemby. It's kind of funny and it's weird. And I guess it's just because of the clips that have been posted. He's slow on his feet, yeah, but he's 7'5". I mean, what can you really expect? Not every, big man is super quick on their feet, and he'll learn with time. So I'm not really worried about that. But people are trying to compare somebody who's 6'2" to somebody who's 7'5", and I just don't think that's a good idea. You got to look at Wemby like he's a center or power forward, wherever you want to, play him at. But, Scoot is a guard, point blank period. Wemby is a big man. So you can't really compare the two. You could compare, their impact, but not their play style. Please don't do that. So if you're on the internet, please stop doing that. But then to move on, Portland got the number 3 pick, which is huge for them. I know you had some stuff you wanted to say about Dame. And, I feel like this kind of directly correlates to them now that they have the 3rd pick. So, they're kind of in a sticky situation where, do you trade Dame? Do you trade the pick? What do you do? Do you try and get a superstar to come here? What would you do? What were your thoughts on Portland landing the 3rd pick?
Yeah, it was kind of interesting, because going back to the Dame thing, on social media, people were talking about, the idea of, like you said, right? Do you keep the pick, and go forward with, picking some young guy, or do you trade the pick and, bring in somebody else,
Right.
right? And of course, there's a lot of people talking about, well, let's try to trade Dame, right? And Dame, he responds on social media and he's like, if the fans want to trade me, start the petition and send it in. And, it is kind of just an interesting situation because we've talked about it at different points previously on our podcast where we said, Portland is kind of in this weird no man's land area of the NBA where
Yep.
they're not really good enough to contend. But they're also like, I mean, they had the number 3 pick, right? But they're also like, because they're in this point where they have, a superstar, or, wherever you want to rank Dame, however you feel about him, because they have, one of the best players, right? They're not really like, because they have Dame, he doesn't want to tank, right? So it's like you're trying to win, but you're not necessarily good enough to win. Um, so they definitely hit the jackpot with the number 3 pick. I talked about it kind of in a previous podcast where one of the more interesting uh, scenarios in the lottery is if they got the number 1 pick. But either way, you take 3.
Hmm.
Like I said, I talked about on the stream where I still think that they should keep it and just take a young guy, um, right? Regardless of whether or not they decide to trade Dame, because I just think like you're not really in a position to me where like, let's trade away the number 3 pick, get somebody else to come in, and then we'll be winners, right?
Right.
Like I just don't think Portland is gonna be good enough to be able to win a title. So to me, I mean, I don't know if they trade Lillard or not, but like I said, to me, I would, if I was running the team, I would move him to somewhere else that he wants to go.
Right.
Just rebuild with, young players you have, and then just kind of roll from there. But either way, if you're Portland, this is a pretty solid spot to be in, right? Where you do have one of the top 3 picks. Obviously, it's not Wenbanyama, but you still should have a pretty solid player.
Yeah.
It just kind of, depends on like, are they going to draft correctly, right? Because you got Shaden Sharp. He seems like he's pretty solid.
Sure.
Right? Obviously, they got Dame way back in the day, right? That
Hmm.
turned out to be a great pick. Um, so I mean, I don't know. Their draft history is kind of up and down, right? Like McCollum was really good,
Hmm.
right? But then you have others where it's like, again, they're just okay, right? Like Zach Collins is just okay, right? He's not on Portland right now.
Yeah.
So just in general, I mean, you have a lot of flexibility, right? And that's kind of the best you can ask for if you're a team like Portland, right? Because again, like, when we move to the next couple of teams, right? Like say Houston and Detroit, right? Those are definitely 2 big losers of the night, right? Because Detroit, I think, had the worst record, right? And they dropped from 1 to 5. I think
Yeah.
that's the first time that's happened
It's
in
bad.
quite some time. Yeah. And then if you're Houston, right, you had, I believe they had I think they were tied with the Spurs for like the second, third worst
They all
record.
had the same chance at getting the number 1
Yeah,
pick, though.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Even if you're 1, 2, or 3, you have the same
Right.
odds, right? 14.5%, whatever it is. So either way, they all had, right, Portland, well, no, not Portland, Houston, San Antonio, Detroit, all had the same odds at winning the number 1 pick.
Yes.
And the Spurs got the number 1 pick, and the other 2 dropped. So not exactly a great position to be in if you're those 2 teams.
Yeah.
Especially Detroit, right? Because at least with like Houston, there's rumors about maybe, they have a ton of cap space, so maybe they use that to bring in veterans like a James Harden or somebody like that, to add to their young pieces, right? But Detroit is really in a tough spot because I don't think you're going to get anybody to come there.
Right.
Um, and you also have to settle for, a lower draft pick, right? And again, they did good with Cade Cunningham. Jaden Ivey seems really solid. Jalen Duran seems really solid, right? But then, Killian Hayes seems like that probably hasn't worked out. Um, so I mean, just in general, I mean, they've done a decent job. But again, if you're Detroit, you would have liked to have been rewarded with the number 1 pick. But
Sure.
um, again, that's kind of one of the interesting things about the lottery odds is that you're in a position where, now just tanking and trying to get the worst record doesn't guarantee you the number 1 pick. I mean, it never did, right? But now that the lottery odds are lower, you have an even less percentage chance. I think in the past, before they changed it, it was you had a 25% chance, right? Which is not super high, right? But I mean, again, you got a 1 in 4 shot
Yeah.
at getting the number 1 pick, which that's you take that, right?
Yeah.
But now it's 14%.
Right.
So that means you have an almost 90% chance of not getting the number 1 pick.
Yeah.
And again, worst of all, you're tied with 2 and 3. So there's a chance you could drop even further, which again, that's what happened to Detroit. That's what happened to Houston. Um, So yeah, just in general, I mean, there'll still be players to take,
Oh yeah, for
right?
sure.
'Cause yeah, because we talked about it in the live stream,
Yeah.
but still, just in general, right? I mean, obviously, if you're Houston or Detroit, you're not happy. If you're Charlotte, I guess you're happy. Um, I mean, I guess you'd prefer the number one pick. I mean, again, I feel like it would have been kind of a worst
Yeah.
case
You
scenario.
said that on the live.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, you could kind of see on Wembanyama's face, right? Like the teams that got the earlier picks or not earlier, but you know what I mean, like, from 4 to 2 before it was the Spurs, you could tell he was relieved to not go to some of those teams.
Yeah.
Like, you could see he was kind of relieved not to go to Houston, not to go to Charlotte. And again, he doesn't have necessarily control over where he goes, right? But
But you can still pray on it.
obviously, exactly, right? As the most talented guy in the draft, as the guy who's, going to be the number one pick in pretty much everybody's eyes, right?
Mhm.
You'd like to go to, one of the best organizations that you can go to. Obviously, the Spurs have been pretty spotty the last few years, right? But you do have Pop, who's everybody seems to like a lot, um, right? And again, they've done a pretty good job in terms of historically, right? Getting some pretty solid talent, right? Obviously, you hit a gold mine with the two number one picks, right? David Robinson and Tim Duncan. So now you got a third one
Yeah.
with Wembanyama. So yeah, I think just in general, like the top five picks were kind of the most interesting ones, right? Because after that, there wasn't, because from five or after five, there wasn't really like that much of a difference,
Yeah.
right? It was kind of like pretty much what you would think. Six going to six, you got Orlando, right? Orlando comes out of this pretty solid because you got the sixth and the 11th pick. So you have the flexibility to either use both, right? Or maybe you can trade up, or whatever you want to do. So they came out of this pretty well, right? Indiana, you get the seventh pick, right? Again, obviously after, the top five, again, you're not going to get as many good guys, but you never know. You could get a guy that you really want. Indiana did show promise as a potential playoff team, earlier in the season before Halliburton got hurt. So I mean, obviously, you'd like to have the most talented player, but Indiana is probably not quite as far off from making the playoffs as, say, like Charlotte or San Antonio for sure. Washington, your team, right? They got
Yeah.
the eighth pick. Again, a kind of a situation where it feels like they probably should have tanked.
Yep.
To get a higher pick. Um, which because again, like you're just kind of in a weird spot where like you don't have, a top pick, so it's probably not going to change your fortunes with so much, right? But you do get a lottery pick. But I don't think their goal was to, get a lottery pick going into the start of last season. I'm assuming their goal was to make the playoffs or at least to play in.
Yeah,
Um,
I thought we were chasing the play, and I think I said that probably in one of our first or second episodes. Like, yeah, I don't
right.
know. It's
Yeah.
just ugly.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting because they're in a weird spot because they don't have a GM right now since they let theirs go. So
Yep.
I do kind of wonder, what they're going to do with that, right? There's rumors about them talking to people, right? And then at the same time, we also have rumors of Myers potentially leaving Golden State. We'll get into that soon. Um, but just in general, yeah, like I wouldn't call them losers because you got a lottery pick, but at the same time, like you should have gotten a higher pick. Like I just feel like there was a point where it felt like okay, they're probably not going to make the play in, so let's just kind of like reset,
But we
right?
continued to
But
win.
yeah, moving on, Utah at 9. They were kind of in an interesting situation for most of the year, right? Because for a while they were a playoff team. I think just early on they had the best record in the West, which was really surprising. Obviously, we knew that wasn't going to stick, but it was kind of funny because we kept waiting and waiting and waiting for them to fall off, but they really didn't until eventually they had injuries and then they were just kind of sitting guys and they threw it in the towel after a while. But I do feel like I would have preferred if I'm Utah to get a higher draft pick. I mean, you
Hmm.
still get a lottery pick. And I guess they'll get Minnesota's pick, I think, right? That one's not a lottery pick, but you still get 9 and I guess, what, a mid-teens pick.
Yeah.
So can't necessarily complain about that, right? And then when we talk about Dallas, right, that's another team, right, where they should be, you know, at least relatively satisfied with where they're at, right? Because there was a chance where if their pick had dropped out of the top 10, they would have lost it and it would have gone to New York. But they get to keep their pick. So you have the 10th pick, right? Obviously, you'd like better, right? But you're not going to complain because you could have lost it, right? I mean, one more pick lower, and it would have been gone. So obviously, again, kind of similar to what we talked about with Orlando or Portland, right? They have the flexibility, to take that pick and draft a player, or they can move it and get somebody else, right? For me personally, I don't know. I feel like if you have Luca, you should probably try to compete. So it wouldn't shock me like if they, put it up in trades, right? In terms of like trying to figure out what guys to grab. I mean, that's personally what I would do. But at the same time, a top 10 pick is always kind of enticing. But I guess, to kind of kick it back to you, I guess, how do you feel about what Dallas should do? Are you kind of on a similar page where you think they should look to move the pick to bring in like, a current impact player? Or are you kind of like in the spot of like, you weren't good this year, so take the top 10 pick and, maybe try to see if you can find a potential, diamond in the rough or something
Okay.
like that. It's just hard because once you get to like 10, you just never know.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious to hear what you think. You know,
I have two things to say about this. I'm gonna say this up front. I'm not a huge fan of the depth in this draft. Um, I feel like there's a lot of guys you can gamble on for sure. You got the Thompson twins. Um, you got some solid NBA ready guys like Brandon Miller, Grady Dick, Jerace Walker, a bunch of really good guys. But how far, are they going to be on the board when you get to 10? That's the question. And like, if you're Dallas, like, who would you even pick out of those guys? So it's like, I'm willing to bet they're probably going to move the pick and probably get somebody who's already established and not take a gamble on a rookie. I just don't think they're in that mindset that where they even need a rookie. Honestly, I think they just need to get some two-way guys and maybe buff up the center position. But outside of that,
right.
and I mean, I feel like that's doable. I feel like that's doable. But I don't know. Their management has been so shaky and weird the past couple of years. So I don't know. I used to have faith in Dallas, but it wouldn't surprise me if they do draft somebody maybe who's NBA ready if they're on the board. But they got to make that decision quick because the draft will be coming up soon. And I did want to say one more thing about the draft before we move on to the later picks, if we are. I'm assuming we're probably going to do a mock draft video or podcast episode. Covering probably majority of the first round. Probably not the second round, but majority of the first round. Just get the guys' names out there, get our thoughts on them as well. But yeah, in regards to the Dallas thing, yeah, you got to just move that pick and get some two-way guys and see how much the pick is worth as well. I think it'll be worth a lot, and I'm sure they can probably figure out something. But that's my thoughts on it.
Right. Yeah. I just feel like personally, in my opinion, I just think when you got one of the best players in basketball, you're in the position where you should try to be competing in the playoffs, contending, at least for again, because I'm sure their goal was to make the playoffs and try to win, right? But
Yeah,
again, I think when you have a guy like that, that's what you should continue to do.
they
You
shouldn't
shouldn't be in the
rebuild.
position of, yeah, exactly. Because again, you found your superstar guy. Obviously, you'd like to get other guys, of course, to put around him. Like you said, get two-way guys. But, again, with that 10th pick, I'm sure there would be teams that would be interested, in maybe potentially giving up some guys, right, to take on that 10th pick, right? Maybe a young team, right, that's rebuilding, right? Maybe they'll be okay with giving up some of their, I don't want to say trash, obviously, right? But maybe guys that, they don't mind
Maybe
getting
even
rid of,
veterans.
right? Exactly, right, yeah, exactly. Veterans, guys that it's just like in general, right, like the Dallas should be looking for in the offseason. Like you said, their front office and ownership has definitely been pretty shaky
Hmm.
as of late. So it's definitely going to be a tall task, especially considering the hole they put themselves in
Yeah,
with the Brunson decision. But this should be a relatively busy offseason for Dallas. I'd be surprised. I'd be pretty, shocked if they weren't at least if their name didn't come up at least, in
yeah.
some rumors
I
for
think they'll
players.
be
Because
making
just
some moves.
yeah, exactly. Because I just feel like again, with a superstar in your, hands, right? And again, there's not very many of them. There's not a whole lot of superstars in the league, especially guys at that age, right? Because again, a lot of the superstars are a little bit older. Not that they're
Yeah.
old, right? But you know, um, just in general, when you got a guy that young, you need to contend and you need to get the pieces around him in order to win. Because
Yep.
you could be in a position where you make too many mistakes, right? And all of a sudden, right, he gets upset, he gets frustrated, and like many other stars that we've seen, in the last few years, he might ask out, right? And
Yeah.
then if you're Dallas, right? I mean, again, superstars don't just grow on trees. So I mean, like, you really got to be careful here, and you really got to be focused and lock down and make the right decisions because again, like Luca is your future. right? Like, because again, you could get a really good guy 10th, right? But it's not going to be Luca, right? And again, he's a guy where he wants to win right now. And just in general, you got to do what you can to make sure that you put them in a position to win. And again, especially because it's primarily Dallas's fault that they're in this position, right? It was very self inflicted, right? Letting
Yeah.
Brunson go when they didn't need to, right? And then as a result, making a panic trade for Kyrie Irving, right? And sacrificing other guys, right? Like that's just self-inflicted wounds, and you can't keep doing that if you're Dallas, right?
Nope.
Because we've seen teams make really damaging mistakes in the past. Some teams are able to bounce back, right? We saw the Lakers, right, where they made the decision to trade for Westbrook that really set them back, and then they were able to get out of it, right? But just in general, right, like you got to tread really carefully if you're Dallas because, I mean, you can't afford to make another massive mistake
Yeah.
because again, the ramifications could be really costly.
Yep.
Um, but I guess to shift forward to another team, right? We already mentioned the Orlando picks, right? They have the 11th pick, but Oklahoma City, right? A team whose future seems pretty bright, right?
Yeah.
They made the play in. Kind of shockingly in a way. I think going into the season, most people felt that they were probably going to be a bottom five team. But they competed. Despite not having Chet Holmgren, Shea was a superstar, right? He was first team All NBA. He was on both of our ballots for first team All NBA. Um, and you got a really good, young core of guys, right? Him, Josh Giddey,
Yeah.
Jalen Williams, right? Hopefully Holmgren becomes part of that too, starting next season.
Yes.
Um, Obviously, again, if you're Oklahoma City, yeah, it would have been really cool to have a top 5 pick,
Hmm.
right? But again, like they have so many picks and they've seemingly done a really good job of no matter what pick they have, finding some level of talent.
Yeah.
Um, so if you're Oklahoma City, you gotta feel pretty good. And again, it's gonna get to a point where there's gonna be guys that you're probably gonna have to move on from because you can't keep every single player you draft. You can't pay everybody. But if you continue to find really good players in the draft, right, that's gonna allow you to, be okay with moving guys and picking up even better guys. So if you're Oklahoma City, again, it's the price you pay for competing,
Yeah.
and being in the play in. But, at the same time, I mean, there are worse spots you could be in, I suppose. But like, either way, regardless, their future is pretty bright, like I said, because we saw what they did. And more young guys are coming. And so far, Sam Presti has done a really good job of, just getting and stockpiling as much talent as he can
Yeah.
have. And he seemingly is able to just find players, just out of nowhere. So I have a pretty high level of confidence that whatever Oklahoma City does with this pick, they'll make the right decision because
Yeah.
they've had pretty good
They're on a
success rate when
streak.
it comes to, yeah. And then I guess Toronto at 13, right? Obviously, they were kind of in a weird spot this year, right? Because they had a really good season last year where they won almost 50 games,
Hmm.
lost to the Sixers in 6. Again, no shame in that, right? The Sixers had talent. Um, but this season obviously didn't really go the way they wanted it to go, right? Kind of from the jump, right? We saw that okay, this is probably not going to be a great year for them, right? They were kind of like for the most part in that play-in mix pretty much the whole year.
Yeah.
Um, it was just kind of weird because again, the roster overall I feel like wasn't super different from last year, but it just didn't pan out right. Not having a big, obviously, for a while hurt them. They got Jakob Pertl. It was kind of weird how they decided to be buyers at the deadline because it's like, okay, what did that get you, right? A play-in spot,
Should have
and then
sold.
you lost. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like we talked about it. We thought that teams should have jumped in on the Anunoby thing. And again, maybe Toronto was asking for too much, right? Because we don't know necessarily what the full offers were. But just in general, just kind of a weird spot for them to be in. Because again, like they had been consistently good for quite a while,
Yeah.
right? And they had a couple of bad years mixed in there, right? They had the year, I think, after the bubble, right? The one year where they were in Tampa, right? Where they weren't very good. But again, you give them the excuse of they were the only team to not play at all at home. So, and then I'm sure that makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
Uh, but I feel kind of weird about what they're gonna do with this pick. Again, they've drafted some decent guys. Right. Obviously, they got Siakam late in the first. Right. That was obviously a huge hit. Right. Van Vliet was undrafted. Right. So
Yeah.
I think, or was he second round or undrafted? I thought he was undrafted.
He might have. I think he was I always thought he was undrafted.
Yeah, but like either way, um, like they've, OG Anunoby, that's another guy, right, that we mentioned. That was a really good player for them. So just in general, I mean,
He was undrafted, FYI.
yeah, that's what I
Yeah.
thought. Yeah, so but just in general, right? Like they've been hitting, on some of these guys. Obviously other guys not so much. But again, it is kind of disappointing if you're Toronto because again, I feel like you weren't that good for most of the year. So in my opinion, they should have just like you said, they should have sold, they should have moved. And again, we kind of felt like okay, maybe you keep some of these guys,
Yeah.
right? Like I think we were both on the mindset of like if you have a chance to get on an Obi, go on and trade for him. I didn't think they had to get rid of everybody,
Right.
but just in general, right? Like, if I'm Toronto, I don't feel super thrilled with having this pick. But again, you never know, right? Because sometimes teams are able to find guys, you know, in that middle part of the first round, right? Whereas like the teams that are at like pick 7 and 8, right, are in that weird spot where like they can't seem to find a guy that's really that great.
Yeah.
So you never know, right? Toronto has a decent drafting history, but but pretty much most of the focus in the lottery, right, is kind of more so the higher teams, right? Like there's not as much that the other teams can do, and they weren't going to expect a whole lot, right? Because they were towards the end of that lottery mix, right? Like, and then I guess the last of the lottery teams, right, New Orleans, right, they were 14th. Um, Kind of an interesting situation for them, right? Because for about what half the season, they were one of the best teams in the Western Conference, right? With Zion, with Ingram. Well, Ingram got hurt early, right? He missed the early part of the season. Um, but just a weird thing, right? Where like, overall, New Orleans was great to start the season. Then they just had a ton of injuries, right?
Yeah.
Zion, Ingram, both guys that unfortunately it seems like, you know, you can count on them to miss time every year, which is unfortunate. Um, they made the play in, and it was kind of interesting because I think we picked them to beat Oklahoma City, and they lost, right?
Yep.
And it was a really close game. They fell apart down the stretch. Um, but it was just kind of interesting because the way that it started out, right? They had a weird situation with their draft pick, right? Where they had a pick swap with the Lakers, where if the Lakers finished with a worse record, New Orleans would take that pick. Whereas they would keep it, right, if they finished with a worse record than LA. And for a while, it looked like that was going to be the case where they were going to finish with a better record than LA.
Hmm.
And especially during that 2-10 start, it looked like New Orleans might have like a top 5 pick on their
Yeah.
hands. Um, but then everything fell apart with the injuries and all that other stuff that happened over the course of the year. So now they're again kind of in a weird spot. I guess again we saw when they were healthy, they had enough talent to win a lot of games. So it's like, okay, you'll take a lottery pick, but at the same time, I do kind of wonder what New Orleans does. I feel like they could potentially move it, to bring in a current guy, like an impact guy right now, just because again, you have, a core of guys that probably want to win. Um, and again, you have a decent amount of young players, so you do have some flexibility there. But again, New Orleans is in a weird spot. Not quite as bad as Toronto because we saw New Orleans have success this year. But again, you just never know if their guys are going to be healthy.
Yeah.
And that's something that you kind of have to take into account when you make a decision about this pick because like you could have a really good young player here, right, to add to the core, right? But obviously you probably have to wait a little bit for them to develop, or you can be of the mindset of, we're good enough to win right now. So let's go and do that.
Right.
But again, they missed the playoffs, so they're probably not great enough to win right now. But again, like when they were healthy, they were really good. So there's a lot of scenarios that they could do here. What are your thoughts on what New Orleans should do?
I think they got a draft. I feel like you have to keep it because you've got to get somebody who's young. And honestly, hopefully, if he's still on the board, I think they should probably get a guard. Another one that is, and I think a good option would be Bryce Sensabaugh. He's kind of like I'm not gonna say modern day DeRozan, but he's similar to DeRozan. But he actually has a 3-point shot that's really consistent. I think he hit around like 40.5% on his triples, but it was only off of 148 attempts. So I don't know. It's kind of interesting, but his defense isn't that great, and he's more of a black hole-ish kind of player. But he's such a good scorer that you can't really pass up on him if he's there. And I feel like that would probably help them, especially considering some of their top scorers have issues staying healthy. So I think they should keep the pick. I think there's no reason to move it, but it would be interesting to see, what they could potentially get if they want to move it. But I'd say, yeah, draft a guard. I think that would help them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not necessarily against that because again, like I do feel like yeah, Zion was out, but they still had stretches where they had most of their other guys and they were still losing. I mean, I
I
think
know.
at one point, they lost 10 straight. Now, in fairness, that stretch was, I think, without Ingram for the most part. Um, but still, it feels like that they had too much talent to be that bad, even without Zion. So
I think
I'm
you just add more talent. I think that's what you do in
yeah,
those
so yeah,
situations.
I'm kind of with you where I don't necessarily mind adding that lottery pick. Again, you just kind of obviously you check to see what's out there,
Yeah.
but again, I don't know necessarily the value of the 14th pick, in the draft
Right.
versus like obviously the number 3 pick I'm sure has a ton of value for Portland. Um, so just in general, it is kind of a interesting position to be in and it's not a position I don't think New Orleans would have expected to be in
Right.
going into the season because I'm sure they expected to be better, right? I'm sure they expected to do that pick swap, but it didn't work out. So just kind of a weird situation to be in if you're them.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree.
So I guess to wrap it up and get into the news, I guess we got a few stories, right? Some related to coaching, right? For example, one just came out recently in the last hour or so, or in the last 20 minutes or
Oh,
so,
really?
mentioning that Sixers interviewing Nick Nurse.
Okay.
This is kind of a guy that we talked about where he was fired, obviously let go from Toronto. Obviously didn't do a great job this year, but he did win a title. And when he has talent, I feel like he's had a pretty solid track record as a coach. Um, and we knew he was probably going to be one of the, top guys to probably get another look,
Yeah.
because again, he's got a good track record. He did win a title relatively recently, right? It was in 2019, but again, it's not the same as winning a title, say, like say like a Doc Rivers, right, where he won maybe what was it like 15 years ago?
Yeah, I think it
So
was what, 2008?
2008.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So just in general, I feel like that this is a pretty good decision because again, like if you're Philly, and then look, we know what's kind of going on. We know that the star players. It sounds like Harden is, or Doc's camp believes that Harden was the driving
Yeah, I heard
force.
about that.
It wouldn't surprise me, but at the same time, like I don't think anybody was shocked, even if Harden didn't say anything. Like
He
they
still
had
would have
three
been
straight,
gone.
yeah, they had 3 straight seasons, of coming up short in the playoffs. So you knew, right, that this was gonna probably be it for him, right? Because we talked about it, where we said like, his job is on the line because we talked about, the ramifications for both Boston and Philly should one of them, should whoever lose the series lose. And we said like if Philly loses, Doc is probably gone because that would be 3 straight playoffs where they come up short in the second round, right? At least with Boston, you can argue that Boston's the better team, right? But again, like 2 of those 3 series they probably shouldn't have lost, right? I mean, like in my opinion, I think it's a massive. It was a massive disappointment to lose to Atlanta the way that they did.
Yeah.
I guess 2 seasons ago, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, that was the worst one, I think. I mean, because the Boston one obviously wasn't great because you had a lead, like the other ones, but there was definitely a realistic pathway for Boston to win, and most people thought Boston was going to win the series anyways.
Yeah.
But it was time to make a switch, right? Kind of like with the Phoenix thing, right? These guys, even though they did a decent job with their teams, we knew they had run its course. We've seen, a pattern of even coaches that have had some level of success, right? Still, are kind of at this point where they can get fired and, kind of get moved to the side.
Yeah.
So Doc, I don't think was, like Doc is definitely not like a guy where it's like he's, free from that, right? Because again, he's obviously has the title, right? But if the other guys who won titles recently were gonna be in a position to get fired, right? Like so could he.
Yeah.
So I think the Nick Nurse one, I think it makes sense, right? Because again, you got to get a coach with some experience, coaching stars, right? He did have that experience coaching Kawhi the year they won the title. And Kawhi is kind of one of the interesting stars, to coach, right? Just because of, the load management issue. But again, it's going to be interesting because Nick Nurse, he's going to have, you know, um, an interesting time with that Philly squad because if Harden stays, right, you got to coach him and Embiid, and those guys are, they're kind of building a resume of, just in the playoffs. It seems like it hasn't translated
Yeah.
don't always give the best effort. But either way, I think this is a decent move if you're Philly, because you got to look for coaches, and we know he's got a high level of success as a coach, even if he did have some disappointing seasons
Yeah.
previously.
I agree 100%. I think you hit on all the points. I think he's a great coach. And if you're a great coach, I think you should have, ample opportunity to prove that and continue your legacy. So I'm with that.
Yeah, and then I guess kind of a huge story, right? It sounds like according to Shams Charania that Bob Myers, GM for the Warriors, it sounds like he and the owner haven't Joe Lacob haven't been able to come to an agreement on an extension, right? And this has been pretty much building over the course of the year. We had
Yeah.
heard rumors about this maybe his last year in Golden State, and it sounds like they're bracing for the likelihood that he's gone. Kind of makes sense if you can't agree on an extension and you've pretty much had an entire season and you still haven't agreed to it, right? Then he's probably gone. Um, Obviously, considering he's the guy that tends to get a lot of credit, um, for drafting a lot of the Golden State guys, or at the very least, the other moves, right? In addition to that, right? Say getting guys like Iguodala, right? Kevin Durant, other players like that. So just in general, I think it is a loss because he clearly seems like he's a pretty smart guy in terms of what he does for that organization, and in general, you don't want to lose intelligent people who work for you. So
Hmm.
I think it's a loss. I am curious to see like if he does leave, where does he go? Because again, he should have a ton of suitors.
Yeah.
Um, I'm sure a lot of teams would love to have him, kind of run the ship. But you just never know because again, I'm not saying that he is this guy, right? But you had the interesting situation with Denver, right, where you have the guy that was responsible for putting, you know, a lot of the guys on Denver together, right? Getting Jamal Murray, getting Jokic, getting
Right.
Michael Porter Jr. I think he was there when they got Aaron Gordon. So I mean, like he put together a big chunk of a Denver squad that's in the conference finals right now.
Hmm.
Um, but then he goes to Minnesota, right? And then he just, he doesn't do as good of a job there.
Yeah.
So it is kind of interesting. But just in general, I don't think that's necessarily going to happen again. Like, because again, I don't know necessarily the tier of decision making that he does. Like, is he the guy that pretty much drafts everybody, like, and has the ultimate say? I
Right.
guess so, but you just never know. But I do think either way, it's definitely a loss for Golden State. Um, and again, it definitely hurts because again, you have Steph, you have Clay, you have Draymond, you have this core of guys that you're trying to contend with. And obviously the guy that put together a lot of those big teams, right? That hurts to lose a guy like that. So, I do kind of wonder where they go from here because we've talked, several times about, you know, where they're potentially headed, just in terms of their future. So definitely not a great start if you're Golden State.
Yeah, I agree with you. He's irreplaceable. You never want to lose somebody who's irreplaceable at all. And like you said, he's gonna have plenty of suitors, so I'm not worried about him, not having a job. I'm just worried about where he's gonna go. And,
Exactly.
who's even gonna bite. I'm sure there's plenty of teams. I would hope that, he could potentially come to the Wizards, but doubt that's gonna
Right.
happen. But, I think, it's great that he's gonna potentially be able to cement his legacy even further somewhere else. Same with the coaching stuff.
Yeah. I mean, again, because it is a big move. Because again, you're talking about a guy that helped put together, one of the greatest title runs
Yeah.
we've ever seen, and
Exactly.
I'm sure again, like the resume speaks for itself. I'm pretty sure any team would love to have him, you know, in a big capacity like that. So
Yeah.
it's going to be interesting to see where he goes because he's going to have time, to decide. I guess there's potential that he could stay, but again, I just feel like if it's been this long and you
He's
still don't
not
have an
saying.
extension, I feel like he's probably
Yeah.
not staying. Um,
And
and
he's the
again, but it has
infrastructure
been
of that team, so it's gonna be
exactly
rough.
right, and it has been kind of a weird last couple of seasons, right? Because they drafted the young guys. It seemed like the Stars wanted them to move the young guys to get more impact players, and they didn't do it. It didn't cost them last year, um, because a lot of their core guys were really, really good, right? But then, this year, it didn't really help them at all, right? Because I
Right.
mean, you look at, some of the young guys, right? Like Kaminga, right? He was a lottery pick. He didn't even play at all in the postseason, pretty
Yeah.
much. Moses Moody was okay,
I
right?
think
But again,
teams are
like,
actually eyeing Kaminga, like, as we
yeah,
speak, so
exactly. Yeah, and I think that he's probably a guy that's gonna have interest because he's young, because he's athletic, because he's got, a lot of potential with his size and athleticism. I mean, I think he's a guy that definitely could have some interest. And it feels like he could be gone just because, again, he's not playing. I mean, I guess, of course, he could get better. He's young. But just in general, I mean, like, you know, it wasn't like they were in a position where, like, they had enough guys. I mean, like, you could see, like, they needed probably a little bit more to help them out. And then, I mean, if he can't play against the Lakers, I mean, like, who else is he going to play against? Because you would think that that would be kind of a team that maybe you could have him on or
Right.
have him play against. But, it seems like Kerr didn't necessarily trust him. And again, I understand, young guys, they're going to make mistakes. And he's definitely no exception. But it's kind of a tough position to be in, right? Because again, he's young. He wasn't, he's on a contender and he's not really getting minutes. So I do wonder what he would look like on another team.
Yeah, me too.
I feel like he'd probably look better, but again, he would be on a team that's not really contending for anything, right? So, it's kind of like the Wiseman thing, right? In Detroit, right? Where he's playing, right? But it's not like he's necessarily helping Detroit win.
Right.
So, it's going to be interesting to see what they do because they have a lot of decisions to make, but they kind of need to figure out what they're going to do because again, they have too many decisions where like you don't want to be in a position where you don't have a GM for a while.
Exactly.
I feel like probably most likely it's going to be. It sounds like according to Shams, it's probably going to be some type of internal hire, right? And sometimes that can be a good thing, and then there's other times where it's not a good thing. It just kind of depends on who it is,
Hmm.
running the ship. So they got a lot of questions to figure out. Just kind of a weird year from them, right? Because again, they won the title. They for most of the season, they were kind of up and down. A lot of people, myself included, still believe that they had a chance to win, right? But it just looked like that they, weren't good enough. So
Yeah.
just kind of a interesting situation where without your GM, you got to find ways to continue to improve and get better as you still have this core of guys,
Exactly.
that I think are still good enough to probably win maybe one more with. I don't necessarily think that they can probably win multiple,
Right.
but they may have a chance to get another one. It's going to be tough because again,
Yeah.
the league is better. You got a lot of really good teams. Um, and I'm not saying that like teams have quote unquote figured them out, right? But like, I mean, this is the first time that they've been healthy and they lost in the Western Conference, right? And I mean, like, it's a first, but I mean, that could definitely happen again next year,
Sure.
even if they improve a little bit. Because again, I do like the starting five, but you do need to find some more depth. So it'll be interesting to see what they do.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Well, I guess that wraps it up for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, these episodes are long, but we do have things to talk about. Even though there are fewer games now, right? We obviously want to cover the games as good as we can, and there's still other things going on. You mentioned the draft lottery, like you said earlier. At some point, we're probably going to do a mock draft thing. And of course, as we get to the end of the season, we'll have tons of stuff to continue to talk
Oh
about
yeah.
as well. So, the playoffs are still going. It's going to be fun. We have fun talking about it, so hopefully you have fun listening to it. So thanks a lot, and I guess we'll see you Monday.